So, beyond the customary garrulousness that surrounds debates like this, with the two rival political sides facing off against each other and the rest of us, the Nigerian public, gaping and gawping while criminal gangs continue their rampage, can it be said that the outcome of all this is not in doubt? In other words, beyond the shouting, what else is there? Unquestionably, these are serious allegations of misconduct against the president, although so far it's just that, allegations, because the exact articles of impeachment haven't yet been framed and the process hasn't been initiated. According to the relevant section of the Nigerian Constitution, which is section 143, the president can be removed from office for gross misconduct. But who determines what constitutes gross misconduct? Granted, we know it's the National Assembly, but is there an overarching definition of what gross misconduct is? Or is that, like most things in the National Assembly, subject to political interpretation, depending on which party you belong to? Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by the respected constitutional lawyer and human rights activist Clement Nwankwo, who's also the executive director of the Policy and Legal Advocacy Center in Abuja. Clement, thank you very much indeed for joining us. First of all, what would be the legal procedure and the process for the National Assembly to begin or to initiate removal proceedings against the president? I understand the relevant section of the Constitution is section 143.
Yes, the section 143 is very clear on the process for the removal of a president. It anticipates that where a president is accused of misconduct, that members of the National Assembly could initiate proceedings against him in the National Assembly, which of course cannot be interfered in or interfered with by any court of law. The procedure is very clear. It's a bipartisan action taken by both the House of Representatives and the Senate, but the petition to remove the president would have to be tabled before the president of the Senate by 1/3 of the 469 members of the National Assembly. Clearly, it requires that, of course, the Senate has only 109 members, so they would need quite a lot more to be able to join for the petition. The Senate President, on receiving the petition from 1/3 of the members of the National Assembly, must present this, and 1/3 is about 156, 157, which exceeds the number of senators we have. The President of the Senate has a responsibility when he receives that petition to set it down for a decision by the National Assembly, deciding that there is merit to those petitions, and based on that, proceed further to create an investigation panel. So it would seem to me that it's not a very easy task to impeach either a president or a governor in a state. It's the same numbers that are needed in terms of numerical percentages. So I think it's quite some way to go. A president is not removed simply by a motion or someone intending to move a motion in the National Assembly. It's a very, very serious business, and usually the allegation must be such as can be described as gross misconduct. And of course, gross misconduct is as defined by the National Assembly, not anybody else. So it's serious business. If there's anyone talking about impeaching the president, and then they must really be quite serious to convince Nigerians that they have consulted within the National Assembly. They have the numbers to be able to do so.
Well, what I'm curious to know, because we're trying to break this down into bite-sized chunks, you talked about the issue of gross misconduct, which is the basis on which an impeachment procedure or process can be started. What, in your assessment, constitutes gross misconduct? Because in the workplace, for example, you're looking at unethical behavior such as theft or physical violence or gross negligence, but it also relates to the misconduct of an employee, for example, that is so serious that it undermines the mutual trust and confidence between the employer and the employee. Which of those would you say applies in this situation, or is it a different scenario in the case of a president?
Again, like I said, gross misconduct is as defined by the National Assembly. So sometimes the objective test is absent in defining what gross misconduct is. And like I said, it's not something that even the courts can interfere with. But clearly, I think that around the country, there is serious concern about the capacity of the president. There is concern about the deterioration of governance in Nigeria. There are several issues that are creating major concern for Nigerians about the capacity of the president to govern. And that could, the incapacity really, although there are provisions for removing the president for incapacity, but basically incompetence could really amount to gross misconduct. And across the country, there are people, and the views are rising about people who think that the level of incompetence of the president is really quite high. And a lot of people are pointing to the near collapse of the economy. A lot of people are pointing to the huge levels of insecurity in the country, where you have citizens being kidnapped on a daily basis from their homes, even in the capital city of Nigeria, in Abuja, where you have terrorists threaten to even kidnap the president, where you have terrorists go to the prisons and free people. This is the only prison or the major prison in the Federal Capital Territory, where you do have terrorists go to that prison, free prisoners, free terrorists or co-terrorists who are in those prisons, and operate for more than an hour without being intercepted or being stopped. Then I think there are serious issues. And if there are persons who are responsible for these failures and the president has not sanctioned any person, then it must mean that there is some level of concern that citizens are having that is really very serious. And I think that when the National Assembly talks about gross misconduct, then this could be part of that definition. And my sense of it is that the president needs to do something more than he's doing to show that unless he's condoning what has happened, then some heads should have rolled from what happened in the Federal Capital Territory. The levels of insecurity are incredible, and I think that a lot of Nigerians have complained that there are violations of the federal character principles entrenched in the Constitution in the way that the president has made appointments. And a lot of people look at this, what is called in Nigerian parlance, the security architecture of the country. The slant of it is worrying, where people are appointed simply because they're from a particular part of the country. Raises serious concerns, and these are all of the issues in the National Assembly could be describing as gross misconduct. But again, we don't have any petition before the National Assembly, and I think that the members of the National Assembly, if they are serious, know what to do. But simply tabling a motion on the floor of the Senate without any petitions, without anybody signing any petitions, and walking out and chanting on the corridors of the National Assembly shows that National Assembly members themselves have to decide that they want to be serious about bringing the president to account. But I think that what has happened in the National Assembly in the last sitting, where members of the opposition especially and some other members of the ruling party walked out, it does not show seriousness about taking the issue forward. You must have at least 150-something members of the National Assembly sign a petition and table that before the President of the Senate, who must act on it.
Well, nevertheless, you mentioned that all those other issues about public sentiment and all the rest of it are in a sense, not applicable when it comes to taking the decision. It's solely up to the National Assembly to discuss what or decide what gross misconduct is. And of course, the other big issue is the arithmetic, which you mentioned, the arithmetic of minority versus majority. Is the presidency therefore right to be overtly confident that the minority will have its say, but the majority will have its way? Or is it possible that with an election approaching and the ruling APC keen to be seen as being on the side of the suffering masses, we could see some APC senators or members of the House of Reps side with those who believe that the president deserves to be impeached for what they say is his terrible handling of the security crisis?
Well, I think clearly with the primaries of the parties and elections coming up quite soon, and the end of tenure of this president becoming imminent, you certainly are beginning to see a president who is lame duck, and you basically are also seeing a political demographic changes in the National Assembly, which means that members of the National Assembly are more concerned about what happens to them post, or in fact ahead of the elections and post elections. Basically, I think political party loyalty at this time might actually be undermined by the fact that the election is imminent, and members represent their constituency. Their constituents feel what is going on across almost every constituency in this country. There's a huge level of disappointment with governments, both the executive and the legislature. There's a huge concern that government has failed. And in that circumstance, it would seem to me that everyone who feels that they are accountable to citizens will take action based on what they feel their citizens are saying to them. And I think a lot of citizens, a lot of voters are saying to persons who are elected at different levels that government has totally failed the people, and that this country cannot continue on this trajectory even for another 6-7 months. The way things are, it is really quite shocking what could really happen looking ahead to the next 6-7 months. So members of National Assembly must also really be very concerned that if these trend of events continue, you might actually have an impossible situation with the elections in February or March next year.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, because I was going to ask you, beyond this particular issue right now of the threat of impeachment, are you worried about the way things are going in Nigeria generally? I mean, you're a political activist, you're a human rights lawyer, well-known activist, and someone who is also a constitutional lawyer. I mean, the insecurity, the economic situation, etc., and the real fear that the way things are going, holding elections in some parts of the country, and I've actually heard some senators express that fear, holding elections in some parts of the country may not in fact be possible because of the level of insecurity in those places. So if some people are saying, you know, the president just has a few months to go, let him ride out his time, you're right in suggesting that if the insecurity continues, it might actually threaten those elections that would legitimately get him out of office.
Well, I think that in the absence of the National Assembly going forward, and you know, it's a very difficult thing with impeachment of a president or a governor. So it would seem to me that a lot of political watchers would be quite cautious about that route. But certainly, the only way to get the president to leave would, of course, be that the president has to leave, but certainly the constitutional process of doing so is having elections conducted in February and March next year. And I think everyone needs to be hands on deck to make sure that that happens and you have a new government in place. But certainly, even if elections were not to hold, the perpetrators of these descends into anarchy and confusion and deterioration, of course, cannot benefit from it. So it means that everyone, including incumbents and citizens, must work towards ensuring that we do have elections hold. My big concern, of course, is that all of the machinery for holding elections needs to be in place. The Electoral Commission needs to be well placed. I have seen the president send in some names of resident electoral commissioners for the states to the National Assembly for approval. Looking at some of the names, I'm quite worried that some members of the Electoral Commission running elections at the state level, resident electoral commissioners, may be friends and associates and relations of serving governors who themselves are members of political party. Some may even be members of political parties. So I worry about the list of resident electoral commissioners sent to the National Assembly for elections. For elections to happen, it must be credible. Where you have partisan persons sent to the National Assembly for approval, then I think that National Assembly, beyond seeking to impeach the president, should actually scrutinize to ensure that elections that hold next year are conducted by persons who are not partisan and who are not nominees of political parties, governors, or partisan interests. So I worry about that list, but I think generally everybody is worried about the process, the security situation and how that could impact on the elections. But beyond that as well, you do have a situation where Nigerians who want to invest in the country, foreigners who want to invest in the country, everyone is arms folded, watching what is going on, watching very sadly the deterioration of the economy. And I think that what is holding now bodes very badly for the country.
Well, that's a very interesting point that you raise, and I think that's something that we're going to obviously have to closely scrutinize. Those electoral resident officers that you were talking about, whose names have been sent through. But just returning to that issue of the threat of impeachment, I mean, given the mathematical calculations that seem to preclude the possibility of the president actually being impeached, do you see this move by the Senate Minority Caucus as, at the very least, a wake-up call, the kind of saber rattling that'll put the president and his ruling APC party on notice that with presidential elections approaching, there might be still a price to pay?
Yes, certainly. I think it's more about the president. What is his legacy? What is he leaving behind? He's been in office for nearly 8 years. He's in office till May next year. What is he leaving behind after 8 years in office? He must ask himself the question. It's not a question really about himself awarding pass marks to himself. That legacy will not be defined by him. It will be defined by the experiences that Nigerians have had in his 8 years of rule, and that experience has not been pleasant. What can he do in less than 8 months to go? That's really up to him to decide what he can do and what he should do. But certainly, I think a lot of Nigerians have been hugely disappointed by the president's performance. Whether he can reverse any of these disappointments in 8 months, I don't know, and there is nothing to suggest that that capacity is there to do so. But certainly, if you got into office very angry about the insecurity in the country 8 years ago, and you're leaving office with insecurity far worse than has been, with terrorists setting up territories within and deep into your country, with people not able to travel, you build rail lines and you shut it down because people can't move with it. People can't travel by road. Basically, a country where people are living in cells and units, avoiding use of transportation systems, where the economy is collapsing. You must ask yourself as president, what is your legacy? And I hope the president, rather than engaging in self-award of marks, really needs to sit down with honest people and ask the question, have I performed? I'm sure he'll get the correct verdict. Whether he can do anything to reverse the perception that is held strongly across the country and by Nigerians and indeed non-Nigerians as to his level of performance, I don't know, but I doubt it, but it's really up to him. But certainly this president hasn't done very well.
Okay, on that note, I want to thank you very much indeed, Clement Nwankwo, for talking to us and sharing your thoughts and your assessment of the threat of impeachment against President Buhari. Clement Nwankwo is a respected constitutional lawyer and human rights activist. He's also the Executive Director of the Policy and Legal Advocacy Center in Abuja. Thank you very much indeed.